how did you get into comics as a fan?
As a fan, good question. The first comic I remember, it was a Daredevil by Gene Colan with Stilt Man, and Matt's twin brother, who was still really Matt.
Mike.
This this total hipster dude with the ridiculous, what's the scoop boop de doop kind of, and everyone's like swooning around him. Yeah. And the Stilt Man is just so ridiculous but cool. That cost just the helmet, and Gene Colan made it look so good, but it's just, what does he do? He strides around on stilts and goes up and down. And then just English comics, 2000 AD, with Beano and all the kids' comics that they had. There was a short-lived magazine called Vulcan, which published some really old English stuff, like The Spider, which is like nobody remembers. It's interesting too, because at that time I had no idea there was even comic shops, you know. So you'd go to the corner shop, newsagent, and they would have just random comics, usually from Marvel in mine. So I didn't see much DC, and I would just grab whatever was there and read the one issue, even though I didn't know what had happened next, what had gone before. Occasionally you get a little pack with like 4 random comics in it, you know. I didn't care, I loved them all. And then Star Wars came out, I subscribed to the Star Wars comic, which turned out to be curated by a guy called Paul Neary, who ended up being the editor-in-chief of Marvel UK. So he indirectly, in the Star Wars comic, was putting amazing stuff as backup stories. So in England you'd get comics that were coming out monthly. In America they would reproduce as weeklies in England in black and white, and then again there would be an anthology, and in the back of the comic they would put short stories, and they could be from anywhere. They could be, or they'd be again serialized. Something like Star-Lord was one. They did Chris Claremont, John Byrne Star-Lord, which was fantastic. But they also had like a Bill Sienkiewicz early one with this lion-headed guy in his kind of more his early Neil Adams era. Learn from the best. That's what you did.
That's 2. That's Neil Adams we heard again today.
Well, yeah, because Bill kind of really looked up to Neil, and Bill's ended up being a really great friend, and I hugely look up to Bill. Huge influence. But yeah, so discovering Sienkiewicz for the first time in the Star Wars comic, and he must have been so young when he did that. It's like crazy young, and he just always Paul, it turned out, put things like Gods from Outer Space by Alex Nino, which was an amazing comic that probably was published in Warren or something like that. I'm not sure if it was Marvel at all. Yeah. But he put up all these really brilliant sort of random Gene Colan spooky stories, and so I was getting a sort of deep dive education from Paul Neary without even realizing it, you know. And then when I met Paul and it turned out he'd done that, I was like, it's you. You got me into this, you know. And that's when the whole Death's Head thing took off with Paul. But yeah, I mean, there's so much you can just go on forever.
I was gonna say, I'm glad you mentioned Marvel UK. I was actually gonna ask you, how did you end up in Marvel UK?
Yeah, I mean, I'd done some work with I'd done some stuff when I was still really young, like 19. I did an issue of the original Death's Head, and I did a Galaxy Rangers, and I inked a Count Duckula. So I had done some sort of random things with Marvel UK, but nothing like solo, or nothing that was really going to shift the needle in any kind of direction or make a difference. And then I had been living back up in Derby and had moved back to London, and was basically looking around to see what was available, looking for work again, reaching out back to 2000 AD and back to Marvel UK. And one of the editors there, John Freeman, he basically had always said, oh look, he'd tried to get certain projects off the ground, and Paul saw some art I'd done for him, which I think it had Wolverine in and a character that I'd done with John Freeman called Rourke, a female character. He's been republishing her actually. And Monarch Starstalker. We pitched this series. It didn't go anywhere, but Paul saw the art and he said, I want to meet Liam. So I went in, had a meeting with Liam, and he showed me this. He just had a feeling that Death's Head wasn't in line with what was happening at Marvel at that time, the old Death's Head. And although it had a very sort of strong fan base, it was selling around 30,000 copies. And that's when Mark Silvestri, Jim Lee, all of those guys were pre-Image, still at Marvel.
Right.
You know, everyone thinks about that style as the Image style. It wasn't. It was the house style at Marvel. And he introduced me to Jim Lee and the stuff he was doing in the Savage Land, and I was just like, oh my, this is just. I loved it immediately, because to me, I saw a sort of line, a link to Barry Windsor Smith. It had that kind of decorative quality that Barry Smith had. Especially like the Savage Land and the Shi'ar and all that stuff. It was just, and I just fell in love with it. I hadn't seen anything like it. It felt, well, as Paul described it at the time, he said, this is state of the art. And I was like, I get what you mean. And I saw it and I got it, and I thought I could do something in this vein, in this feel. I think I can do something like that. Anyway, that night I did a sketch of Death's Head, basically a totally different one. It looked like it had a hockey mask, and it was scary, and it had the horned ears, and it was very kind of fax days, you know. I roughed it out and I faxed it to Paul, and I wrote a note about I always felt like Death's Head should look like this, and Paul immediately got back in touch and said, "Can you come in again tomorrow? Can you come in?" So I was like, okay. He said, I want to do this, so we're going to scrap the what we've been doing, which it's, when you're young, you don't sort of think about the ramifications. You just get excited. So I was like, oh, amazing, I'm going to do Death's Head. And then it's like, then you start going, oh no, that means I've taken this guy's job. Right. You know, right. Simon Furman's no longer writing it, and it's Jeff Senior's no longer drawing it, and now I'm drawing it, and Dan Abnett's writing it, and we've just totally taken it off them. Thankfully, they forgave me, and they've done all right since. You know, but you know, I was just swept up in the moment, so excited by it, and I did the. For some people, it's iconic. A lot of people these days don't remember those characters. It's 30 years ago. But the first cover where the new Death's Head 2 is holding up the head of the old Death's Head, that went out in Sales to Astonish, which was, I guess, like your guys' comic back then. It's like the previews of its day. It was a little black and white, but I think it was sent out by Marvel, and it was sent to retailers, and it would have all the order stuff in there, but it was black and white. It was a much less slick affair, and it was and so that Death's Head went in black and white, and it just touched a nerve. And I guess because, you know, to me it was like, and it's pretty obvious, it's a cross between Predator and Terminator, but with horns. And it just landed, and the orders jumped. They went from the 30,000 up to 350,000, like 10 times the orders. And Paul was like, "Oh, okay, we need to think about this. Maybe it would take a beat." So they delayed it a little bit, decided to fully get behind it, did a great big campaign. They even got a suit made, which I got the pleasure of wearing for a couple of minutes. It was done by the guy who did the Batman suit. It cost like £6,000 at the time, which was like a ton of money back in like 1991, 92, 91, yeah. And they even shipped it over to San Diego for the Comic-Con for it, which was good. He was Death's Head was on the Marvel stand.
Oh, nice.
They snapped one of his horns off to make sure there was no drugs inside it. Customs, which is like, oh no! I just thought it looked cooler. Appropriately badass.